Sou Éder Camuses, maestro do coral da Universidade de Brasília, UnB. Tenho o prazer de apresentar a vocês nosso segundo vídeo de coro virtual com a música Tempo Perdido, de Renato Russo. Renato Manfredini Júnior nasceu em março de 1960 no Rio de Janeiro. Em 73, com 13 anos, se muda e fixa residência em Brasília, na Asa Sul, plano piloto. Em 82, forma, junto com Marcelo Bonfá, a banda Legião Urbana. Em 83, entra Dado Villa-Lobos e em 84, Renato Rocha. E assim temos a formação clássica da banda. Em 85, lançam seu primeiro álbum, Legião Urbana. Em 86, o segundo, denominado 2, onde consta a música Tempo Perdido, seu primeiro single, que se tornou, segundo o ECAD, a música mais tocada da banda. Neste vídeo, o coral da UnB vem homenagear a nossa cidade, a nossa Brasília, que completou em abril de 2020 60 anos. Vem homenagear também Renato Russo, que em março deste mesmo ano completaria 60 anos. Com a participação muito especial de Marília de Alexandria ao piano, Homero Rodrigues no baixo, Cacá Barros na bateria e com arranjo vocal e violão de Éder Camuses, o coral da UnB interpreta Tempo Perdido. Muito obrigado.
Somos tão jovens, tão jovens, tão jovens.
Na minha tela voltou original, era para ter sido um fundo. Boa tarde, sou Sérgio Nazaré, professor do Departamento de Ciências Contábeis e Atuariais da Universidade de Brasília e diretor-geral do 6º Congresso UnB de Contabilidade e Governança. Espero que estejam todos bem e preservados. Para dar início à cerimônia de abertura do nosso congresso, convido todos a ouvir o hino nacional do Brasil. Belos vídeos, Brasília e Universidade de Brasília. Vamos agora ouvir, para saudar o nosso evento em nome da Universidade de Brasília, um vídeo gravado pela magnífica reitora Márcia Abraão.
É com muita satisfação que participo da abertura do 6º Congresso UnB de Contabilidade e Governança. Começo me solidarizando com os que perderam amigos ou familiares para a Covid-19 e com todos que precisaram enfrentar a doença. Infelizmente, ainda temos que ficar separados, realizar nossas atividades por meio de telas sempre que possível, o que garante a nossa segurança e a daqueles que amamos. Os avanços na área contábil de governança são significativos na última década em todo o país. O fortalecimento de órgãos de controle e a ampliação dos mecanismos de transparência possibilitaram maior fiscalização por parte da sociedade e acompanhamento do uso dos recursos públicos. Na UnB, fizemos mudanças importantes nessa área, tais como a aprovação do regimento interno da auditoria, que se fortaleceu, passou a agir principalmente preventivamente, de forma autônoma e em parceria com gestores. Também houve a aprovação da política de gestão de riscos da universidade. O relatório de gestão, que sofreu profunda alteração a partir de 2018, se tornou mais acessível, trazendo os resultados da UnB em linguagem clara e objetiva, servindo assim como fonte fidedigna sobre tudo o que realizamos em termos de ensino, pesquisa, extensão e gestão. A criação de uma Câmara diretamente vinculada ao Conselho Universitário conferiu maior agilidade à tramitação de projetos de pesquisa, ensino e extensão e contribuiu para ampliar em 84% a arrecadação com essas iniciativas, além de aprimorar o acompanhamento acadêmico e administrativo dos projetos e a prestação de contas. Outras medidas de transparência e fortalecimento da democracia interna também foram tomadas, a exemplo da discussão e aprovação do plano de obras no Conselho de Administração e a implantação de sistemas de gestão mais atuais e de interface mais amigável. As atividades docentes e as resoluções dos conselhos superiores, por exemplo, agora estão disponíveis para consulta pública no portal da UnB. Temos ainda muitos desafios, comuns a muitas instituições públicas. Cito, por exemplo, a lentidão processual e a dificuldade de compreensão, por parte da sociedade, das especificidades das instituições de ensino superior e de pesquisa, como aquelas para aquisição de equipamentos e insumos para a pesquisa, o que muitas vezes dificulta o trabalho dos nossos pesquisadores e docentes e aumenta a nossa desvantagem em relação aos países desenvolvidos. Por isso, são tão importantes eventos como este congresso, já tradicional em nossa universidade. Parabenizo a FACE, o Departamento de Ciências Contábeis e Atuariais e o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências Contábeis pela organização do evento. Estou certa de que as reflexões surgidas nesses próximos dias serão de grande importância para a melhoria da governança nas instituições públicas. Um abraço e ótimo evento.
Agradecemos as palavras da magnífica reitora. Vamos passar agora ao vídeo do diretor da Faculdade de Economia, Administração, Contabilidade e Gestão de Políticas Públicas, professor contador Eduardo Tadeu. Apenas um esclarecimento. Meu nome completo é Sérgio Ricardo Miranda Nazaré. Professor Eduardo Tadeu.
A todos, bem-vindos à Universidade de Brasília, bem-vindos ao 6º Congresso UnB de Contabilidade. Aqueles que não são da UnB, em nome da Faculdade de Economia, Administração, Ciências Contábeis e Gestão de Políticas Públicas, lhes dou as boas-vindas à UnB. Este é um evento que a gente, como o próprio nome diz, está sendo realizado pela sexta vez. Vale aqui ressaltar um pouco da história deste evento. Conforme vocês podem notar, a gente já está com o nosso 6º Congresso de Contabilidade da UnB. Aí é necessário que nós retornemos 7 anos no tempo e lá, nos idos de 2011 e 2012, o professor França, quando era chefe de departamento, teve essa ideia de fazer um congresso de contabilidade da UnB, a exemplo do que já existia em outras universidades. Não evitou esforços, aprovou, fez um projeto, convidou o professor Paulo Lustosa para presidir o congresso, e o professor Paulo Lustosa aceitou a tarefa. O professor França continuou apoiando, apesar de não presidir o congresso, mas fundamental a sua participação nos patrocínios, na divulgação do evento para a nossa comunidade externa e interna, e conseguimos realizar o primeiro congresso de contabilidade. Essa incumbência foi transferida para o professor Paulo Brito, depois para a professora Mariana, e atualmente a professora Beatriz também foi presidente do congresso num determinado ano, e agora o professor Sérgio Ricardo. Todos eles aceitaram esse desafio de produzir um evento desta magnitude numa universidade pública, que envolve um certo grau de complexidade, dados certos regramentos aos quais estão submetidos as universidades públicas, e principalmente por se tratar de recursos públicos envolvidos. Mas aquela ideia inicial do professor França frutificou, e hoje nós temos aqui o nosso 6º Congresso de Contabilidade se iniciando. Neste ano, num formato diferente, tivemos que vencer o desafio da pandemia. A pandemia nos afetou de maneira muito forte, mas continuamos mesmo assim a ideia de realizarmos o congresso. E mudamos o formato desse congresso para esse ano para um evento que era presencial para não presencial, totalmente não presencial, e obtivemos sucesso, dado a quantidade de trabalhos que foram submetidos, dado a quantidade de inscrição que recebemos. Sem dúvida nenhuma, conseguimos êxito neste evento. Parabéns aí ao professor Sérgio Ricardo Miranda Nazaré, parabéns à professora Daniele, à professora Ludmila, professora Mariana Guerra, que foram aí fiéis escudeiros e puderam vencer inúmeros desafios e trazer esse evento hoje aqui para toda a comunidade. Eu gostaria de desejar a todos um bom evento, sei que nós teremos um evento, e de antemão já convidá-los para o ano que vem participar aí do nosso 7º Congresso de Contabilidade. A gente tem mantido os eventos do Departamento de Ciências Contábeis, o evento, o Fórum do Terceiro Setor vai ser realizado, e outros eventos mais aqui para abrilhantar cada vez mais a nossa faculdade, o nosso departamento e a nossa universidade. Boa noite a todos, obrigado.
Professor Paulo Mendes, chefe do Departamento de Ciências Contábeis e Atuariais da Universidade de Brasília e um grande apoiador desta edição do Congresso, fará a sua saudação. Professor Paulo.
Bom dia a todos. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de saudar a todos os membros da abertura do nosso 6º Congresso de Contabilidade e Governança da Universidade de Brasília. Saudar aos nossos palestrantes, aos nossos professores, a todos os alunos de pós-graduação e de graduação que submeteram os seus trabalhos. Sejam todos bem-vindos. É um prazer, é uma honra muito grande poder recebê-los. Nesta edição, teremos 4 palestras internacionais, 2 painéis temáticos, 2 workshops, 3 sessões paralelas com 8 salas simultâneas para a apresentação dos 120 trabalhos aprovados. Gostaria nesse momento de agradecer a todos aqueles que acreditaram e enviaram os seus trabalhos para a submissão do nosso 6º Congresso. Nossa ideia é que esse seja um momento importante para o debate acadêmico, com temas atuais e relevantes para a comunidade, para a melhoria da informação contábil, para a governança corporativa, para a contabilidade pública e financeira. Como é tradição do nosso congresso, teremos tradução simultânea para as palestras internacionais. Nossa equipe estará à disposição para que você tenha o melhor aproveitamento do congresso. Nessa edição, que é especial para mim, depois de 3 congressos consecutivos à frente do departamento, não poderia deixar de expressar o meu mais profundo agradecimento a todos os professores do Departamento de Ciências Contábeis e Atuariais da Universidade de Brasília, que sempre me apoiaram em todas as decisões, aos professores do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências Contábeis da Universidade de Brasília, a equipe do 6º Congresso de Contabilidade, aqui representada pelo professor Sérgio Nazaré, ao ENAP, que nos acompanhou nesse processo de transmissão das webinars, a toda a equipe da Finatec, que sempre nos acompanhou em todas as edições do nosso congresso, a todos os alunos, a todos que, de uma certa forma, contribuíram para a realização desse evento. Finalizo aqui desejando a todos um excelente congresso e que todos tenham o maior aproveitamento possível.
Professor Jorge Katsumi, a quem tive a honra de ser aluno, falará em nome do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências Contábeis e Atuariais. Vamos ouvir o professor Katsumi.
Bom dia a todos. Espero que todos estejam bem de saúde e protegidos contra esta pandemia. Eu sou o professor Jorge Katsumi Nyama, coordenador de pós-graduação do Departamento de Ciências Contábeis e Atuariais da UnB. Sou também o presidente de honra deste 6º Congresso de Contabilidade e Governança. Nós trabalhamos muito, e a equipe principalmente, para o sucesso deste congresso, que será 100% virtual. O nosso programa de pós-graduação em Ciências Contábeis teve uma participação ativa neste 6º Congresso de Contabilidade e Governança. Nós tivemos vários de nossos docentes integrando a comissão organizadora. Os nossos docentes também participaram ativamente do processo de submissão e correção dos artigos submetidos, atuam também como membros de consórcio doutoral e eventos de extensão relacionados ao nosso congresso. Tivemos também vários alunos de mestrado e doutorado que participaram submetendo artigos nesse congresso. Mais uma vez, a Universidade de Brasília proporcionou um importante apoio para a organização deste congresso. Também estendo os agradecimentos à Finatec, aos colegas do programa de pós-graduação, aos professores do CCA e também um agradecimento especial a 2 professores que foram pioneiros e que, de certa maneira, foram responsáveis pela edificação, ou melhor, a pavimentação deste congresso. No caso, os professores José Antônio França e Paulo Lustosa. A eles, nossos sinceros agradecimentos adicionais.
Muito obrigado aos gestores e apoiadores do 6º Congresso, professores Eduardo, Paulo e Katsumi. Vossos apoios foram fundamentais à realização do 6º Congresso. Nosso mais profundo agradecimento. Vamos ver agora a saudação de um apoiador, posso dizer, histórico dos Congressos de Contabilidade e Governança da UnB. O presidente do Conselho Federal de Contabilidade, senhor Zulmir Ivânio Breda.
Olá a todos os participantes desta 6ª edição do Congresso UnB de Contabilidade e Governança. Quero fazer uma saudação especial ao professor Sérgio Nazaré, coordenador desta 6ª edição, e já parabenizar pela programação do evento, com temas de alta relevância e muito atuais para a nossa profissão. Destaco a excelente decisão de incluir temas da contabilidade pública, com relevância dentro da programação também. Contabilidade esta que é importante para a transparência, para o controle das contas públicas no nosso país. Nesse sentido, eu quero dizer que o Conselho Federal de Contabilidade possui, inclusive, representantes no Board Internacional de Emissão das Normas de Contabilidade Pública, o IPSAS Board, que é um órgão da Federação Internacional de Contadores. E isso tem nos facilitado a realizar o processo de convergência das normas de contabilidade pública aqui no Brasil, o que é feito através de um trabalho composto por um grupo assessor com representantes de diversos órgãos públicos, notadamente dos especialistas da Secretaria do Tesouro Nacional, a quem eu quero aqui aproveitar a oportunidade para agradecer a colaboração que tem dado. Mais da metade das normas de contabilidade pública internacional já foram convergidas aqui no Brasil. Nós pretendemos concluir esse processo de convergência até o final do próximo ano, 2021, e a implementação prática de todo esse conjunto de normas até o final de 2024, nos 3 níveis de governo, federal, estadual e municipal. Concluído esse processo, eu tenho certeza nós teremos a contabilidade pública brasileira alçada a um outro patamar de importância, colaborando, acima de tudo, com o controle, com a transparência e dando credibilidade às nossas demonstrações contábeis, que serão, inclusive, comparativas com a dos demais países e órgãos públicos estrangeiros. Todo esse processo é acompanhado também de um programa de educação profissional continuada, visando capacitar e qualificar os profissionais da área pública brasileira para que possam implementar essas novas normas em todo o país. E, nesse sentido, a participação e o apoio das academias, das universidades, das faculdades, dos centros acadêmicos é de suma importância. E o Conselho Federal tem procurado sempre essa aproximação com o meio acadêmico para que nós possamos preparar os futuros profissionais e, acima de tudo, também manter aqueles que já estão no mercado perfeitamente atualizados às necessidades dos dias de hoje. Então, fica aqui o meu agradecimento ao convite e também o desejo de sucesso nesta 6ª edição do Congresso UnB de Contabilidade e Governança. Muito obrigado a todos.
Registramos nosso agradecimento especial ao presidente Jomar. Os senhores vão ver no dia de amanhã, talvez alguns já tenham visto, um vídeo onde buscamos contar a história de como foi construído o Congresso UnB de 2020. Não foi fácil. Não foi fácil fazer um congresso 100% virtual a partir de uma história de 5 sucessos muito bem edificados. Como deixar de lado as conversas no cafezinho, os drinks logo após o encerramento das sessões e a oportunidade de apresentar uma cidade linda, Brasília, para os ilustres visitantes de fora do país e de outras regiões do país. Pois bem, em março de 2020, tudo mudou. O que era um projeto em crescimento tornou-se um desafio de fazer um novo projeto, com a mesma sequência de melhorias impostas pelo passado. Num ambiente agora 100% virtual, sem nenhum percentual de lambuja. Cadê o cuspe-giz? Poxa vida, cadê o tablado? Cadê a lousa? Nada disso possível, apenas as telas. A turma de professores do Departamento de Contabilidade se juntou, debateu, monitorou o mercado, fez benchmark, depois de muito estudo, debate e reflexões decidiu. Vem aí um congresso com submissão, com painéis, com palestrantes internacionais, com workshops, com consórcio doutoral, com tudo que tem direito ao congresso, só que 100% virtual, repito isso. Meu especial agradecimento e registro ao departamento e todos os professores que nos apoiaram o tempo inteiro. Para isso acontecer, vocês vão ver no vídeo, não vou fazer nenhum spoiler, teve um ente que foi muito importante, uma parceria que se deu aqui em Brasília. O UnB e a ENAP se juntaram e fizeram uma bela série de webinar. Não percam o vídeo. Bom, eu não poderia deixar de aproveitar essa oportunidade da cerimônia de abertura de registrar o meu mais profundo agradecimento à equipe que colocou esse congresso de pé. Eu acho que eu tenho o dever e a diligência de agradecer o apoio que recebi dos diretores executivos, Ludmila Mero e Abimael Costa, 2 apoios muito distintos, muito fortes e fundamentais a esse congresso ficar de pé. Aos diretores técnicos científicos, Mariana Guerra, isso mesmo, está no nome, uma guerreira. Tá? E é um grande professor de finanças, de novo, que eu tive a honra de ser aluno recentemente no programa de doutorado, professor César de Búcio. Houve uma meia-noite num dia de semana, mais precisamente uma terça-feira, que entrou para a história do Congresso de 2020. 200 trabalhos submetidos e 120 aprovados. Parabéns à diretoria técnico-científica e, com certeza, esse parabéns é extensivo aos diretores de área que muito nos ajudaram. Os diretores financeiros de administração, desculpe, as diretoras financeiras de administração, Daniele Montenegro e Francisca Souza. Se alguém sabe o significado de 24 por 7, pergunte a essas meninas. Quanta dedicação e quanto apoio. Muito obrigado, Daniele, e muito obrigado, Francisca. Aos diretores institucionais, professores Paulo Mendes e o já citado várias vezes aqui, professor Antônio França. Que parceria e que apoio irrestrito. Muito obrigado. Ao diretor do consórcio doutoral, José Alves Dantas, pode deixar com ele que tudo funciona, tudo acontece, tudo se realiza. Muito obrigado. Ao diretor de iniciação científica, professor Eduardo Bona, que no meio de um grande projeto pessoal, achou tempo para poder nos ajudar no Congresso. A diretora de eventos de extensão, professora Beatriz Morgan, vocês vão ver o trabalho dela em 4 eventos, 3 apertando a tecla SAP. Muito obrigado, Bia. Aos recém-chegados e fundamentais no formato do novo normal, aos diretores operacionais Alex Laquis e Wagner Santos. O peso de vocês foi fundamental para a reta final do Congresso. Muito obrigado. Não poderia deixar de registrar o meu agradecimento na abertura a todos que proporcionaram essa epopeia se realizar. Realmente foi um trabalho e uma distância muito grande que percorremos, sempre unidos, sempre com muito debate, sempre com a bola na frente, e conseguimos estar aqui para termos 4 palestras internacionais, 2 painéis temáticos, tá? 3 séries de 8 salas simultâneas apresentando os trabalhos e, tá, a parceria de todo o Departamento de Contabilidade e do PPG Conte. E para encerrar a cerimônia de abertura, vamos ver a vinheta do nosso patrocinador, o Banco do Brasil.
Quem tem uma empresa já ouviu muito sobre o novo normal. Mas já imaginou como pode ser o novo fenomenal? E o novo extraordinário? As novas possibilidades. O novo maravilhoso. Para levar o seu negócio mais longe, o primeiro passo é visualizar. E você tem o Banco do Brasil inteiro para te ajudar a chegar lá. Já imaginou? Banco do Brasil. Vem ser cliente.
Muito obrigado ao BB pelo apoio a ajudar esse congresso a acontecer. Se estivéssemos no congresso tradicional presencial, eu agora estaria olhando para a mesa da cerimônia de abertura e pedindo para que todos se sentassem para que nós pudéssemos dar início ao primeiro debate do nosso congresso. Como isso está sendo feito de forma totalmente virtual, nós vamos ter um pequeno intervalo, é pequeno mesmo, menos de 2 minutos, para começarmos a primeira sessão do nosso congresso. Muito obrigado pela presença de todos na cerimônia de abertura. Um bom congresso para todos. Boas palestras. Obrigado.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Professor Nobes. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Nice to see you.
Just a second, we'll be beginning right now.
Okay, I'll turn my email system off.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all well. Welcome to International Conference and the 6th UNB Accounting and Governance Congress. Again, this is the initiative of Accounting and Actuarial Science Division, CCA, and the Postgraduate Program in Accounting Science, PPG-CONT, both at University of Brasília, UnB. I am Sérgio Nazaré, professor at Accounting Division in University of Brasília. I recently finished my doctorate course here at PPG-CONT, the UNB Postgraduate Program. With me at this event will be Professor Jomar Rodrigues, who also teach as our Accounting Division in graduation and post-graduation courses. The main aim of our conferences is to enable discussions with academic community, professors, researchers, students, and society, promoting a debate on accounting and finance topics on public, private, and third sectors. Again, just remember, our event this year, 2020, is 100% virtual and online. In our first international agenda, we will deal with the theme, Accounting for Goodwill, and analysis across space and time, with the special participation of Professor Christopher Nobes, who is professor at Accounting and Holloway and the University of Sydney. He was also an adjunct professor at Norwegian School of Business, Oslo. He was a member of Accounting Standards Committee of UK and Ireland, and a member of the board of International Accounting Standards Committee. He has been a consultant to PricewaterhouseCoopers since 1987. He has been joint editor of Accounting and Business Research, and now on the editorial boards of 9 journals, including Abacus, Accounting and Business Research, and British Accounting Review. He was chosen for the Outstanding International Accounting Educator Award of the American Accounting Association in 2002. In 2015, he won the Distinguished Academy Award of the British Accounting and Finance Association. In 2017, he was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of Social Science. Professor Nobes researches into the nature and causes of international difference in financial reports. He was named in Managerial Finance as the second most productive UK author from 1991 to 2010 in the world's top 44 accounting and finance journals. Professor Nobes was joint winner of the Abacus Manuscript Award for the best paper in 2011. Before moving to the presentation for Professor Nobes, I would like everyone to open the Menti.com site and register the following code that I will show to you right now, just a moment. Please open the Menti.com as you see in the top of my screen and put the code 466844 and 4 because we will use the Menti.com as a pooling questions. Professor Nobes will ask me and I'll show the questions to you. I will come back to the presentation. Stop sharing my screen. Professor Nobes will talk to the audience along the presentation. Feel free to ask a question through the chat. And he will ask a quiz question, again, with Menti.com, with the word Professor Nobes. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Let me see if I can share some slides. Here they are. So, with luck, you can see some slides. And
yes, we're seeing your slides. It's okay.
Good. And here is an outline. I want to talk first about the words that we use for goodwill, because there's a lot of confusion and difficulty, particularly in translation. Then to ask how goodwill has been calculated over many years and differently in different places. Then once we've calculated the goodwill, what do we do with it afterwards, year by year? Then to look at what we academics have done to try to discover the effect of different methods, and then to ask what's going on at the IASB and the American standard setter on the subject of goodwill at the moment. Since it is 1 month until Christmas, I thought I would start with a literature review, and as like all good academics, so we could go to St. Luke chapter 2, verse 14, and it says, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." This is perhaps a mistranslation from the Greek. It should probably say goodwill to persons rather than goodwill to men. Anyway, this is the beginning of the language problem. What's the word for goodwill in Italian? I start with Italian because the Italians invented accounting, at least in the sense of double entry bookkeeping. And nearly all the words in English for accounting, except for goodwill, come from Italian. Debit and credit and ledger and journal and capital and accounting and auditing. These are, of course, all Italian words. Bank, cash, etc. So we have the word avviamento in Italian, which is purchased non-consolidation goodwill. So here I'm buying not a company, I'm buying a set of assets from another company, perhaps, and I'm paying a little bit more than the visible assets. And this is avviamento. Then I do something quite different. I buy a new subsidiary by buying the shares in this other company, and I get an accounting problem because it doesn't add up. So I stick in an extra debit called difference arising because I'm doing consolidation. And this is quite a nice description then of goodwill arising on consolidation. What do we have in Portuguese? Well, in Europe, in Portugal, they have this word, trespass, for avviamento. As I understand, you do not have that word in Brazil. And then we have agio, which rather amusingly in the Netherlands means something completely different. It means share premium. And then in Portugal, the word for goodwill arising on consolidation is goodwill. So in Portugal, they gave up and decided to use the English word. So you can see already there's some language problems here. And why does it matter which sort of goodwill it is? Well, the first sort of goodwill, of course, since it arrives in the set of financial statements of a real legal entity, is relevant for such things as tax calculations and dividend calculations. So for example, in Germany, the amortization of the goodwill is tax deductible over 15 years. And the goodwill hits your income statement, changes the amount of profit that is available to pay dividends. By contrast, goodwill arising on consolidation in most countries is not at all relevant for tax and dividends, because groups cannot pay tax and groups cannot pay dividends in most countries. Certainly that's true in, for example, Germany and the UK and Portugal. So it doesn't matter what you do with goodwill arising on consolidation for such issues as tax and dividends. What is in IFRS 3? Well, both of these types of goodwill are in IFRS 3, though you would not understand that because there's only one word for it in English. And IFRS 3 does not discuss this issue at all. In the United States, the complication is irrelevant because the regulators are only interested in consolidated financial statements of groups. The parent company and the subsidiaries do not produce published or audited financial statements. In France, they have even more words for goodwill. So we have internally generated goodwill, of course, and that is not to be accounted for, says IAS 38, paragraph 48, and the French agree. Then we have something called fonds commercial. Again, this is the asset deal. So I spend 10 million cash on buying some assets from another company. What I buy appears to be worth about 8. So I've paid 2 too much because it's a going concern. And that 2 is fonds commercial. Now I change the subject and I buy a company for 100 million. I go to visit the company and I find that it thinks that its assets are worth 70, but there's some missing assets like brand names called fonds de commerce, and then the assets are understated because they're at cost, for example, by 12. So I add the 12 and I add the 10, and that's, the French have a nice expression for this, écart d'évaluation, and that all adds up to 92, but I've still paid more than that. So the extra of 8 is the degree to which I've paid too much, and that's écart d'acquisition, equivalent to differenza d'un consolidamento in Italian. So there's lots of even more words in French for different types of goodwill. English then, in this particular case, is rather poor, I'm afraid, does not have enough words to make everything clear. What does the FASB and the IASB think that goodwill is? Well, it contains 6 components, they say. The degree to which the assets that you can see are worth more than the subsidiary says because it's using cost, for example. Then there's the missing assets like brand names. Then there's the fair value of the going concern element. Then there's the fair value of what you expect you're going to be able to improve by combining your new subsidiary with the existing business. Then, if you're, for example, paying for all this with shares, you might have miscalculated that. Then, because it's the management buying the new subsidiary, and the management is not using its own money, it's using the shareholders' money, they might be too keen to buy the subsidiary. That indeed is what all the economics research suggests. So part of the goodwill is that they've paid too much. We can eliminate number 1 and number 2 by doing the fair value exercise properly. We can eliminate number 5 by doing a proper fair value exercise on what we're paying if it's not cash. So 3 and 4 are apparently core goodwill according to the standard setters. And if you read the basis for conclusions of IFRS 3, they say that this is an asset. I don't believe that at all, incidentally. Those paragraphs are completely unconvincing to me, but that's incidental. Now let's ask, how has the goodwill been calculated over various periods and places? In continental Europe, until rather recently, the calculation used book values, not fair values. That would, of course, understate goodwill compared to present practice. Until 2009, the Americans took account of planned restructuring as part of the goodwill calculation. They also wrote off, as part of the initial consolidation, acquired in-process research and development, which of course might have been the very reason why you were buying the subsidiary in the first place. And both US and IFRS treated the fees paid to Goldman Sachs and Pricewaterhouse and the lawyers, treated the fees as part of the cost of acquisition, but not now. Now, if you could remember those facts, let us do some simple calculations, and then we'll do a polling to see what you think the answers are. So, example, supposing that we pay 110 million cash for all the shares in a new subsidiary. We go to visit the new subsidiary and we find that it thinks that its net assets are worth 60 in its balance sheet. But we think that one of the things we're buying is in-process research and development, which we think is worth about 18 at market values. We think the other assets like land, if they were properly market valued, would be worth about 80. As soon as we get hold of this subsidiary, we're going to spend a lot of money sorting it out, restructuring. We've decided to do all this, and it will cost us 15. And then we have to pay the lawyers and the bankers and the accountants 10 to make it all work. And the question is, given those facts, how much is the goodwill? And I'm going to ask three versions of this question. How much is the goodwill now? How much was it before the recent changes in IFRS? And how much was it before the changes to US GAAP? And it's the previous slide that reminds you of the changes. So the US took account of restructuring, the US wrote off R&D, and both in the past treated fees as part of the cost. So there's our facts again. So Sérgio, could we have a polling question on the first of these?
I will share my screen. Your will be stopped. Just a second.
Thank you.
Oh, people are already answering your question. You are seeing the message, Professor?
I can see it, thank you.
We have some answer. If you could wait a moment, please. Or
well, that's fine. How much is the goodwill under present practice?
For those who are entering now, please open your menti.com and use the code that is on the top of the screen, 466844.
So, Sergio, I think this is telling us that 18 people think the answer is 60, is that right?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay. So we'll wait for a few more to vote.
We have now 30 answers right now, everyone. I think it's the beginning, the first question. If you could wait just a little, Professor.
Sorry, Sergio, you...
This is the first question. I think some people are opening the mention right now. If you could wait some moments.
Yes, we will.
$43. I think we have a first place and Sorry.
Okay, well, that will do, I think, as we'll wait for some more later. So let's focus on this question first. And most of you think, or the biggest number of you think the answer is 60. Well, this is good because the answers are spread over the place. But actually, that's not the answer. But I won't tell you the answer until we have done all three of them. So, but let's note that you think the answer is mostly 60 and a bit 40. So could we do the second question then?
Okay.
And the second question asks, under IFRS, how much was the goodwill before those changes that I showed you? In particular, for example, the treatment of the lawyer's costs and so on. Good, here's some votes. So 60 and 40 are still winning.
You have almost 30 answers right now.
Okay, well, that's a good indication, I think. Now, I don't know whether you can still remember the figures, but let's ask the third question then. How much was the goodwill under US GAAP before the changes? And I'll remind you, the Americans used to take account of the restructurings they planned to do, which is 15 in my example. And they also took, however, they wrote off the R&D. Notice this is quite a good game because we're getting lots of different answers. So it's a question worth asking. Okay, so 30 is winning this one. By quite a way. That's probably fine. That gives an indication. So let's stop that polling and I'll return to my slides if we can. Thanks.
Okay,
so
you can share a screen again.
Yes. Here we are. So I hope you can see my screen. So let's have a look at what I think the answers are. So for number one, you thought the answer was mostly 60 and to some extent 40. However, I think the answer is 12. That is, what are we paying? Answer 110. What are we getting? Answer 80 plus 18 equals, and the difference is 12. I hope that's okay. So this is worthwhile then experiment because we're finding out new things. For the second one, what was IFRS a few years ago, it was, you thought mostly 40 or 60, but I think the answer is 22. That is, the difference is that 10 there, that we used to treat that as part of the cost. So the cost was said to be 110 plus 10 equals 120, giving us goodwill of 22. And then the third one, what did the Americans think goodwill was until a few years ago, and most of you thought the answer's 30, but I think the answer's 55. That is, the cost was 110 plus 10, and what the Americans thought they were getting was the fair value of the net assets minus having to spend 15 to sort it out, and that adds up to 55. So I hope you're enjoying this game. At Christmas, you sometimes run out of games to play with the family. Here's a new game for you to play. I'm sure they'll all be enjoying this. Change the subject to non-controlling interests. Now, this used to be called minority interests, and it was shown as a liability in the United States. The Americans invented consolidation in about, well, to be more exact, the first set of consolidated statements was 1901, US Steel. And for more than a century, they showed any non-controlling interest as a liability. It's quite clear, however, from the conceptual framework that this is not a liability, but it took a very long time to admit that, basically. So now we think it's part of shareholders' funds. Further, the US did a fair value exercise only on the parent stake. So if they bought 80% of a subsidiary, they just did a fair value exercise on 80% of the assets, or a pro rata, of course. We still, though, have a difference of view. The Americans think that everything should be grossed up. And in Europe, we thought that it shouldn't be. I'll explain that in a minute. And therefore, IFRS 3 allows two different methods for calculating non-controlling interests and goodwill. So let's have a go at this calculation. Suppose that the size of non-controlling, Suppose P pays 100 million, but this time to buy only 80% of the shares in S. And the remaining 20% of the shares are worth at market value 22 million, which is less than you might think proportionally, but that's because P paid a bit of a premium to get control. Anyway, the 20% of shares have a market value of 22 million. S thinks its net assets are worth 70, but we think at fair value they're worth 90. Now, what is the goodwill under the non-US method, which says, let's not gross anything up, we'll just consider what P is paying and what P is getting. And this is the option in IFRS 3, which we mostly use in most European countries, in fact. And then the other question will be, under the US method, which grosses everything up, that is, it grosses up the value of the subsidiary and the value of what it's worth in both in its accounts compared to the market. How much is the goodwill under that basis? Well, maybe we could have a vote just to see, just to keep you awake. So could we have a polling question? How much?
Yes, I will share it. Yes, I will share the screen again, just a second.
Yep. Okay, here we are, good. So how much is the goodwill under the non-US method, which is a sort of net approach? that? So we pay 100, the rest is worth 22.
Mm-hmm.
Net assets are 70 or fair value 90. Okay, that's quite a few votes. But you notice, again, this is really interesting. Each of those possibilities, at least somebody is voting for, so it must be a good question. This is more difficult, of course, especially if you're not a financial reporting type accountant. Well, that'll do for that question. So you think it's 28 mostly, or a bit of 10. Could we do the other polling question? What do the Americans think it is? So here they gross up both the market value and the net assets. Oh, excellent. We've got everything being voted for again. Fine, we'll give it another few seconds. Okay, well, we could stop there. So 30 wins, 32 comes second. Thank you very much for joining in. We can stop that, Sergio, thanks, and I'll return to the slides. So, given those numbers, I think the answer is this. Just going to move this out the way, I hope. No. No, I can't move it out the way. Given those numbers, I think the answer is this then, that the European method is 100 minus 80% of 90 is 28, which was one of the popular methods that you chose. Well done. The US method is 122 grossed up minus 90 equals 32, which was the second most popular answer from you. Okay, good. The point is, though, that we get different answers depending on the date of the calculations, the gap we're in, and in this case, the choice that the company makes. Let's keep going. I'm going to look soon at what we do with the goodwill once we've calculated it, starting with negative goodwill and then going to positive goodwill. Before we do that, maybe a few minutes of questions so we can break the session up. Have we any questions?
Professor Nobes, I have one first question here from Professor César Tiburcio. I mentioned him on the opening ceremony. He is a professor for accounting postgraduate program here at UnB and one of the founders of our content division here at UnB. He asked to you about the slide 10. I don't know if is the same number of the slide, but he said that some researchers consider that accounting's role is not to measure the company's value, but to provide for this task quality information. Don't you think that when trying to recognize goodwill, the company would not be failing to provide useful information to the user and influencing the value of the goodwill that could be measured by the user? What's your opinion on this?
Okay, good question, thanks. So the question begins with some researchers consider that accounting's role is not to measure value, but to provide information for that task. I guess maybe all researchers should think that. I agree that we don't think that the balance sheet is supposed to measure the company's value. And the IASB also does not think that. So I think we all agree that the purpose is to give useful information to investors so that they can calculate future cash flows related to estimating the company's value. So we agree on the starting point. But then trying to recognize goodwill, the point I suppose is this, that we are only recognizing purchased goodwill. So we only recognize goodwill if we've paid cash for it, usually. Sometimes we might have paid shares, but let's suppose we pay cash. So we pay cash to buy the shares in the subsidiary. And we are, in a sense, then not making up the goodwill. We're saying we paid this cash. So we're going to put a debit in our consolidated financial statements that equals what we've paid. Some of it's land, some of it's buildings, some of it's inventories, some of it's goodwill. So the implication of the question is that we'd sort of made this number up, but on the other hand, we have actually paid the cash. So I'm not sure it's quite as bad as all that. The alternative would be just to leave a horrible hole in the balance sheet. And you probably don't think you've thrown your cash away. You think you've used your cash for some good purpose. So that's a sort of answer to at least part of the question.
Okay, from my point of view here at this time, I have other questions, but I think it's a little more ahead from your presentation. I don't know if the audience needs to ask some questions, our colleagues at Brasilia.
Otherwise, we'll keep going and take more questions at the end.
Okay, if it's possible, I think we go ahead, and on the end, we have several questions here.
Fine. So negative goodwill, let's start with that. It's easier to get that out of the way. All sorts of treatments have been invented for this. So the Americans, until 2009, decided that you should get rid of it by allocating it against the fair values of the non-current assets. So, and that disposed of the negative goodwill by writing them down. Another possibility, which they did in Germany until some years ago, was to say, well, it's a credit balance, let's call it a reserve. So it was shown in the equities section. In France, they showed it as a liability. Well, that, of course, would add up. It's a credit balance. In the UK, we did something amazing. We said, well, let us show it as a negative asset. Now, if there was some goodwill, positive goodwill, we knocked the negative goodwill off of that. But if there wasn't any positive goodwill, we actually showed it as a minus figure on the left of the balance sheet. This is in our standard FRS 10, which ran until 3 years ago. And IAS 22, the old international standard, said the same. It was based on UK GAAP. Now, of course, we think it's income. Assuming we've checked our calculations properly, we think it's income. So that's an amazing selection of possibilities, all of which had happened in different places. Let's move to positive goodwill. And in the US, for most of the 20th century, their approach was to put it in the balance sheet and then to amortize it rather slowly over 40 years. They got 40 years by asking this sort of question, what is the goodwill? Well, we don't know, but it might be loyal customers, trained staff. What's the maximum that the trained staff could last in our company? Well, 40 years. Okay, so we'll slowly get rid of the goodwill over this long period. To give you another example of, and therefore the US is not very interesting to look at because everyone did the same. Second example of not very interesting to look at is in the early 1990s, I went all around the world, paid for by PwC in quite nice hotels and aeroplanes, to write books on international differences in financial reporting. The last chapter of each country comparison was consolidated financial statements. And when I got to Lisbon, I was told, good news, we can now go to lunch because there's no point in discussing consolidated financial statements because no one in Portugal has ever prepared a set of consolidated financial statements. So in the US, it was boring, and in some countries, there was nothing to say. So let's go to a country where there was chaos, because that's more interesting. That country is the UK, where we have a lot of data and a lot of variety. Here's some numbers. And these are surveys of 300 companies in each case, so it's quite big data. And in 1969, we had 38% of companies treating it as an asset, but just leaving it forever in the balance sheet. Then 6% amortizing it, 20 as a negative reserve. You notice earlier we had a negative asset in the UK for negative goodwill. Here we've got positive goodwill as a negative reserve. And but eliminating immediately from reserves was the popular practice. More interestingly, of course, it doesn't add up. It adds up to more than 100. But this was because 26% of companies did more than one practice in one set of financial statements for different acquisitions. And then over time, you notice that by the time we get to 1988, nearly everyone is doing the same thing, which is buying the subsidiary, calculating the goodwill, and then deleting it immediately from the assets and deleting an equal amount from reserves. We like doing this because if goodwill is never an asset, you never have to amortize it or impair it. Therefore, no debit ever hits the income statement or earnings. And so what about amortization then in more detail? Well, 40 years for the US. In the EU, we had a directive in 1978 on accounting, and this told us to use 5 years, which they'd got from Italy. Then in the UK, we said that goodwill should normally be eliminated immediately against reserves. And it specifically said you could use more than one method in one company. Obviously, the standard setters were not very strong. If all they could do was to say normally, doesn't really sound like a standard, does it? And then the international so-called standard followed the UK. It might look the other way around, but actually IS 22 was following the draft that had been published of the UK standard. Then the 7th directive in the EU, which is about consolidated statements, had a 5-year amortization period, but allowed immediate write-off. Aha, the Australians. This is the Australian standard, and it says must be amortized over 20 years maximum. Now that got into the UK's, excuse me, exposure draft of 1990. I sat on the committee that wrote ED 47. It led to a huge crisis because here we were proposing that goodwill must be put in the balance sheet and must be amortized, which would then hit the earnings, and companies hated it. and they told their auditors this must never happen, and there was a crisis. And among this and other reasons led to the standard setter being closed down and replaced by another standard setter. And so for 7 years, nothing happened. Then a new standard setter came in and suggested 20-year amortization, but something new. In IAS 1, you probably know there's what we call an override. That is, it says, you must follow the standards. If necessary, you must give extra information. And sometimes, if necessary to give a true and fair view, is the original of this. The IAS 1 actually says fair presentation. This is the Portuguese in Europe for true and fair view, anyway. Sometimes, says the law and IAS 1, you must break the rules if that is necessary to give a fair presentation. And the UK standard took that and said, well, maybe we should override amortization because impairment only is better accounting. In practice, no one took any notice of that. They just did 20-year amortization. But this is the beginning of the idea of impairment only. So in summary, what have been the lives of Goodwill? Well, 40 years US, 5 years in Italy, and the EU directive, and Japan, incidentally. Japan is very keen on amortization. 15 years in German tax law, 10 years in Sweden, 20 years in Australia, and then the UK standard, and then the revised IAS 22 until recently. The IFRS for SMEs says 10 years. The UK GAP said 5 years because 10 years was illegal in the UK because of the directive. But the directive has recently been changed in 2013, so now we say 10 years. The Americans think 10 years for unlisted companies and not-for-profit entities. As you can guess, these numbers have just been made up and made up differently in different places.
Professor?
Yeah.
Before going through impairment, is it possible to have one specific question about this slide?
Yeah, let's do that.
Professor Katsumi, who teaches here at UnB too, for master's and doctoral degrees, he asked, when you refer to the old standards, you comment on the lives of Goodwill, this screen, mentioning examples of countries that, in the past, adopted Goodwill amortization in 5, 10, 20, or even 40 years. Currently, the impairment test is adopted. Amortization based on the number of years is objective, whereas the impairment test requires more subjectivity. Does this procedure allow the practice of creative accounting or earned management? Thanks, Professor George Katsumi.
Well, of course, the answer is yes, but any interesting accounting is subjective. So if we look at for pension accounting, for example, it would be much easier to say that we will not record a pension expense until we pay the pensioners. And we will not record a pension liability because we're not going to pay them for 20 years. And that, of course, is exactly what we used to do. And it's what they still do, for example, in France and in French GAAP. But we have decided that although it's a terrible guess how much the pension expense and the pension obligation is, it's better to put this terrible guess in than to put 0 in. And I think it's this, with any interesting accounting topic, it must involve guesses. Only really boring things in accounting do not involve guesses. So, for example, you could record your land and buildings at what you paid for them in 1950. That would be a definite number in the balance sheet, but surely an irrelevant number, which is not of any interest to anyone. By contrast, if you record your land and buildings at today's market value, it's a bit of a guess, but at least it's an interesting guess. And I think the same applies to this issue, that it's true that amortization will give you a definite number, but a very uninteresting definite number. And as we see from all these different years, the standard setters have just made up a length. You then get a definite number which is easy to audit, but surely not very good accounting information. So that would be my response to that.
Thanks, Professor. You could go back to Lisbon, or you can go ahead. What's your suggestion?
Let's keep going with a bit of impairment, and then we'll have some more questions.
Okay.
So, impairment only. Where does it come from, and what do we think of it? Well, actually, although at first sight it looks as though it comes from America, actually it comes from David Tweedy, who was the first chairman of the IASB for 10 years. He and I together represented the UK on the previous board, the International Accounting Standards Committee. And it was David who first suggested impairment only in 1989 in a series of newspaper articles in the Financial Times. And he, of course, was the chairman of the board that wrote FRS 10 in the UK in 1997. And then he became chairman of the IASB, and we got impairment in IFRS 3 soon after IASB was created. Of course, at first sight, it looks as though the Americans invented this because of 2001 here, but really it was invented before that. The American impairment only was introduced as part of a political fix, because they had something previously called pooling of interests accounting for acquisitions and mergers. This method gives no goodwill. Goodwill does not arise in this method. So since there's no goodwill, you don't have to amortize it. And the FASB did not like poolings, so they wanted to abolish them. But this upset all the American companies, because then they'd have goodwill and then they'd have to amortize it, and that would hit earnings. So the FASB did a deal and said, we will abolish poolings and we will abolish amortization of goodwill. So it was replaced with impairment only as part of that deal. Here is an example of the results. So this is the UK moving to IFRS for the first time, which we did in 2005, but we were practicing in 2004. And you see the UK column. That enormous administrative expense is not paying the wages of the staff or buying paper or renting Xerox machines. Most of this 7 billion, because these are in millions of pounds, the pound is still worth more than the dollar. So this is more than $8 billion. Most of that is goodwill, which when we moved to IFRS for the same 6-month period, means that we moved from gigantic loss for 6 months, more than $3 billion for half a year's loss. And that is miraculously turned into $3.5 billion profit for this single reason of abolishing goodwill amortization. So that's pretty exciting, the effect of goodwill. However, the impairment test is difficult to do, so there's been a series of simplifications. First, even if you are doing quarterly accounting, which you are in the US for listed companies, you only have to do a once-a-year impairment test. It saves a lot of work. Second, fairly recently, the Americans introduced an option which says, if you like, you don't have to do a numerical test of goodwill impairment. You can do a qualitative test. You can say, well, do we think that the subsidiary is still okay? Do we think if we did a numerical test, would we fail it? And if we think we would not fail it, we don't have to do it. So that saves quite a bit of work. That has not arrived in IFRS yet, though they are thinking about it. And that leads us to a polling question. In March this year, the IASB issued a discussion paper wondering how to change goodwill. Should they reintroduce amortization? Should they keep impairment and make it a bit easier to do? So, Sérgio, could we have a polling question related to this? What do you think the IASB should do? And here's some possibilities, I hope. Sérgio, are you still with us?
Yes, please,
Could
sorry.
we have a polling question on what should the IASB do?
Yes, I'm just opening it. The last one, I think.
It is the last one, though we're going to have it twice.
Oops, sorry. Is this one okay?
That's it, yes. Could you vote for what you think the IASB should do? All of these things had happened in various places. Somebody likes other.
Almost there.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I think that gives us an impression of what the vote would be if we allowed it to go on longer. So let's stop that, and the winner is impairment only, followed by 5-year amortization. We'll do some more and then decide, and then have the same question again later. So could we leave that and return to my slides? I'm now going to look at what the academics think. So here's some of the things that they think. Here's 2 papers which suggest, one by Steve Zeff and one by me, that suggests that goodwill has been such a major problem that it led to the end of the American Committee on Accounting Procedure, which was running until 1959. That was the standard setter in America till 1959. Then the Accounting Principles Board, which was the American standard setter until 1973. And I suggest in that paper in '92 that it was one of the main reasons why the Accounting Standards Committee was closed down in the UK. So it's always been a major problem to the standard setters, not just to companies. Then some empirical research. This is US paper suggesting that goodwill amortization makes the link between the earnings number and share prices less good. In other jargon, it's not very value relevant. Here's Mary Bath, who used to be on the IASB, saying that amortization is too long, it's too slow to fit the declining in value of the subsidiary. Now that's not surprising because this is an American paper and they were using 40 years, of course. Now we move into the impairment period. And here's some researchers finding that in a particular country, despite everyone apparently using the same accounting standard, there were lots of different approaches to defining cash generating units for goodwill and measuring discounted cash flows for impairment. Then some American researchers suggesting that managers use their discretion relating to what they call unverifiable estimates, and this postpones goodwill impairments. And some other American researchers agreeing that impairments are made too late. Here's some researchers suggesting that impairments do contain useful information for investors, but actually it's better under an amortization regime than under impairment-only regime. Here's some other researchers suggesting that nevertheless impairments do contain useful information for investors. And then me with a colleague looking at translations of the word impairment and the problems that that causes. I'm just going to look at this issue for a few minutes. So the linguists would say that the word that we see, such as the word impairment, is just a sign. For example, the word cat could equally well have been the word dog in English. It doesn't matter. As long as we all agree that cat means cat, it's just a symbol. What's important is what the word is supposed to be telling us. And in the case of the word impairment, it comes like many long English words from Latin, and it means to make something worse. There's another Latin word which looks similar but has nothing to do with it, and this leads to other English words like par or pair. And if you play roulette, you might notice that on the roulette wheel, you've got ampere and pair. The ampere are the odd numbers on a roulette wheel. The dictionary says that impairment is to spoil something or make it weaker. And in English, we often use this for hearing or sight. So my hearing is impaired, it's got worse, or my sight is impaired, I have to wear glasses. But that's not the accounting set of words, of course. In accounting, there's something horrible. When you look at IAS 36, you discover that there's no definition of impairment. This is very bad because when you then try to translate it into Portuguese, you've got no definition, which is a major problem. And we'll see in a minute how we get to problems with that. The Americans, introduced the word at various dates into their accounting standards, and it arrives in a title of an accounting standard in 1993 in the States. We should note, incidentally, that we have another relevant word here, depreciation, and that means the systematic allocation of cost over useful life, which has nothing to do with impairment, which is a nasty, surprising, one-off loss of value. And when you deal with impairment, we need to distinguish four things. One, damage to the asset. Two, an economic fall in a market value caused by that. Three, we accountants sometimes taking account of that, but sometimes not, because, for example, if the asset was valued at cost, even if it's damaged, it might still be worth what we're showing in the balance sheet. And then there's the debit. And here's the translations of IAS 36 in a whole load of languages. Swedish, for example, says downwriting, nedskrivning. In German law, it says unscheduled write-off. Depreciation is scheduled write-off. Impairment is unscheduled write-off. That's quite a good translation, really. But actually, the German version of IAS 36 says another word, fall in value. And then you see through all these languages, whether they're Germanic type languages or Latin type languages, that we get fall in value. Here's an amusing one. So the French word for impairment is depreciation. You can see where that's going to lead us in a minute. Then we get to Arabic. The Dutch realized there was a problem here, and they invented a special term, special fall in value. In Portugal, they just made a mistake, I'm afraid. They got the wrong Latin word, and the Portuguese translation of impairment is completely wrong as inequality. Now you in Brazil realized that they'd made a mistake. So the Portuguese version of IAS 36 is quite different. Your version is this, that's what you call impairment. Now that, of course, is a translation of number 3, not number 1. And then we have Chinese and Japanese. In fact, the only language with a translation of damage is Korean that we found. I'm just going to summarize that, and then maybe you have some questions. So most of these translations are the wrong word. They are loss of value. They're hyponyms, that is, they're using a word which is too big. For example, they're using the word color instead of the word red. So this would be like telling motorists, when you are driving and you get to the traffic light, you should stop when the traffic light goes colored. Now you can see that's rather a dangerous instruction, instead of you should stop when the traffic light goes red. Some of these terms are newly invented expressions, which are sensible because they can have a special accounting meaning. Only one is equivalent to damage, and that's the Korean. But I think only you have got this right, because impairment is, of course, an accounting activity, which is the reduction in recoverable amount. So everyone else has misunderstood, and the IASB has not helped by not defining the word, but you've managed to work out the proper translation, I think. So I'm not suggesting literal translations. I'm suggesting that people need to think, what is the IASB trying to say before they do the translation. And lastly, I'm not suggesting that this mess has made accountants do impairment badly. What accountants do is read the standard and they follow all the mechanical techniques. So probably this has not caused incorrect impairment charges. There is a quite different problem though, which we'll get to in a minute. What happens in annual reports? Then we get to a problem. But did you have some questions related to translation?
I did not receive any question specifically meaning translation. We have several ones, but I don't know if the people that are running the chat could help me. Are there any questions about translation in the chat? Just a moment, Professor.
Well, we can save them to the end. Let's keep going. Now, looking ahead, we should stop when? When should we stop the whole thing, Sérgio?
Our time, you're referring to the time?
Yes.
On 17 Brazil, 5 p.m. So I think we have more than almost 50 minutes. I have several questions here, but
okay,
I think we are on time.
Going. Right, I'm going to keep going then with the next problem, which is this. This discussion here, which is about translating IAS 36 into various languages. Now, the next point is this. What about when companies translate their annual reports into English, which is quite a different issue. This, of course, is very common. Nearly all large French and German and Brazilian and Japanese and Chinese translate their annual reports into English. So we have followed this word impairment into, for example, a German annual report that the company has translated into English, and we've seen what the previous mess has led to. So we looked at 11 countries, obviously not ones that speak English, and followed the word into translated reports. And here's some examples. This is across the top here: Germany, Spain, France, Hong Kong, Italy. And here's a series of words which we find in the annual reports, which we consider to be bad words that do not tell the readers that we're talking about impairment. So, for example, a lot of the German companies say depreciation when they mean impairment, as do French companies, not surprisingly. And then a lot of the German companies and a lot of the Italian companies say write down when they mean impairment. Well, of course, impairment is a type of write down, but there are loads of other types of write downs too. So to say write down does not tell the readers what's going on. Depreciation is worse, of course. Depreciation is an annual, not very interesting expense. Impairment is a one-off, nasty surprise, which is interesting. And in terms of the percentages of companies that got it wrong, this is in 2005. So 39% of German companies got it wrong, according to us, 39% of Italian companies, 27% of Spanish companies. This is big then. So a very large proportion of English language annual reports read all over the world have made a mistake here. Something else you notice, though, surprisingly, there are no mistakes in Brazil. There were no mistakes in China. There are no mistakes at the bottom there in Korea or Russia. So this is odd. Let's check why. So there's plenty of evidence of people getting the words wrong in annual reports. The German firms are actually following a translation of their law, unscheduled write-offs. Translations get better. So you might have noticed on the right of the slide that at a later date, there's not so much error. And this is the strange thing then. The further the language is away from English, the better people are at translating the reports. So there are no errors in China, no errors in Japan, but plenty of errors in Germany. I think the answer is this. In Germany, they think they can speak English, and therefore they don't bother to check. in Japan, they know they cannot speak English properly, so they do bother to check. And in particular, what happens is this. The auditors do the translations. So if you read a Korean or a Japanese company's report in English, it will begin with the words Deloitte or something like that. They've done the translation and they've got it right. So I'm happy to have any questions, but we could just keep going.
We have several questions here, Professor.
Right.
By this time, I have 3 sources of questions. One already prepared by our colleagues here at UnB, other from the chat, and a third source that I discovered right now is the Q&A. I will try to organize it, and please help me if I am saying a question that is not in the time of this question. I do apologize previously. And I will do the first question from Mr. Katsumi again. He asked about Portugal and Lisboa. Lisboa is a very nice city. Some Brazilians enjoy it a lot. Just to improve our understanding on positive goodwill, when you refer to Portugal, Lisboa, I think I am saying it in Portuguese, Portugal, Lisboa, sorry. No one in Portugal had ever prepared consolidated statements. What does that mean? Wasn't that mandatory in those countries? From another point of view, holding companies were analyzed separately from the subsidiaries.
Yes, good question. Yes, it does mean that. And now there's a surprise here. So the Americans invented consolidation in 1901. It did not arrive in Lisbon until about 1994, incredibly. So it took more than 90 years to get from the United States to Portugal. And even in France, there was no requirement to do consolidated financial statements until 1989. So this is amazing. And why did Portugal introduce consolidation at all then? And the answer was because the EU directive required it. So in one of my previous slides, we go back to that issue. It's a little way back, but I'll get there eventually. We had directives, for example. So there is the 7th directive. The 7th directive of the EU required companies to prepare consolidated financial statements. Of course, Portugal was not a member of the EU at that date. When Portugal joined the EU, it had to do these directives. So consolidated accounts arrived in the middle of the 1990s in Portugal, but Portugal was not the last. It was also not done in Luxembourg or Belgium until really the 1990s. Why? And here's a really major point. What is the purpose of financial statements? Well, if the purpose is to calculate tax bills and calculate dividends, then you do not need consolidated financial statements. You only need consolidated financial statements if the purpose is to give useful information to investors. Now, approximately speaking, there's no stock market in Portugal. So you didn't need to give useful information to investors. So you didn't need consolidated financial statements. And the subsidiary question coming from Professor Katsumi. So yes, you just had individual financial statements of the subsidiaries and the holding company not consolidated, which are the ones relevant for tax and dividend calculations. Okay, useful question. Any more?
Yes, I have 2 questions here. One another from Katsumi and Cesar Tiburcio. They are related. Could I join? I would say the two, and you please answer it. You discussed some possible alternatives for the recognition of negative goodwill, considering countries and IFRS, either by allocating against the fair value of assets, reserves, liabilities, negative assets, or income. Consider these alternatives. Which one, or more than one, do you consider more useful from the point of view of accounting theory? And together with this negative goodwill, Mr. Cesar asked, in your opinion, what would be the most appropriate method to deal with negative goodwill?
Okay, thanks. As academics, of course, we should always question the question before we answer it. I noticed that the question said, which method do you consider more useful from the point of view of accounting theory? Mm-hmm. And so I questioned the question. I think there's two different things here. Accounting theory isn't really about being more useful, I suppose. And so if we answer the accounting theory one first, what is negative goodwill in theory? Then we go to the conceptual framework, I suppose, and we say it must be one of five things. It must be either an asset or a liability or equity or expense or income. That's all it could be in the conceptual framework. And obviously, some of those things it cannot be because it's a credit balance. So really it either has to be equity or liabilities or income. And does it meet the definition of liability? That is it a present obligation to pay somebody some cash? Obviously not. So we're now down to only two possibilities in theory. It must either be an element of equity or it must be income. And if it's an element of equity, how did it get there? And there's only two possible ways for it to get there. One, the shareholders gave us some more cash. Two, we made a profit. Well, of course, the shareholders haven't given us some more cash. Therefore, it must be income. So in theory, the answer is it's income. But returning to the other part of the question, what would be more useful? Then that, of course, is quite a different issue. And that's going back to the empirical research. What do the users of financial statements find more useful information from? And we don't know, because it's, in a sense, a fairly small point. There aren't that many examples of negative goodwill. I don't think anyone's investigated it. But I think probably the most useful thing to do is to show a one-off piece of information to the investors that something surprising has happened, and calling it income at the date of acquisition is a piece of one-off information that's surprising. So I think possibly that is the best answer, and it certainly fits the theory if you start from the conceptual framework. I think that's actually dealt with both of the questions at the same time.
Thanks, Professor. We have some other questions here, but I am a little concerned about the participation of Mr. Jomar, who is waiting here to debate with you. And if it's possible, what is your opinion to go ahead and then come back to the questions? Because I have to introduce Mr. Jomar.
Fine. Well, I've got 5 minutes more, so I'll just keep going, shall I?
Thank you.
So, recent documents from regulators and standard setters. You know that sometimes documents have misleading questions or leading questions. Here's a leading question. This is the European standard setters and the Japanese standard setters, and they publish a document saying, should goodwill still not be amortized? Of course, this is rather a leading question. They're suggesting the answer in the title to their document, and it supports amortization. Then the European standard setters a little later are more careful. They investigate possibilities, and they've changed their mind, really. They say there's little support for the change from impairment. Then even the Japanese, who are famous for wanting amortization back again, they say once they ask the analysts, the users of financial statements in Japan, they get mixed views. The arguments about amortization then from Japan and Italy, for example, are that the purchased goodwill that we bought on the date of acquisition is wearing out and being replaced by internally generated goodwill. So what we've got left after 10 years is not what we should have in the balance sheet. Secondly, the impairment test is subjective. Thirdly, impairments come too late. But then there's a huge but, of course. If the alternative is amortization, then to me, that's a meaningless expense because it's a made-up length of time and it's the same every year, and it contains, therefore, no information. In the UK, when we had amortization until 2005, the Financial Times and the analysts published earnings number that deleted the amortization because they thought it was a meaningless debit. So I suspect that financial analysts just delete this expense, which is a powerful argument. So lastly, and very near the end, in June last year, the IASB discussed all this, and it was very narrow. 8 people wanted to keep impairment, 6 people wanted to bring back amortization. That's pretty amazing. So they wrote a discussion paper in March this year, which goes with the majority, the small majority, and proposes to keep impairment, but to change some of the detail. The FASB, also in 2019, was more even-handed. They too allowed the possibility of bringing back amortization, but in July 2020, they say, well, maybe they'll do both. So they're still thinking about it. In more detail, this is what the IASB proposes to change IFRS 3. There should be more disclosures about why the subsidiary was taken over and then whether it really has worked year by year after that. But the IASB concludes there's not really a better way of doing the impairment calculation. Nevertheless, we should not bring back goodwill. Balance sheet should show equity excluding goodwill. And we should have an American-style qualitative test if it looks as though impairment is not necessary. And we should allow companies to do the discounted cash flow calculations differently by taking account of things which at the moment are not allowed, uncommitted restructuring and planned enhancements. And we should continue to separate out as many intangibles as we can so that goodwill is reduced as much as possible. My answers to these questions, incidentally, are these. I'm not very keen on these disclosures because I think there's guesswork. And this isn't guesswork about what did happen, it's guesswork about the future, really. I think I agree that it can't be improved. I think I agree that we should have no more amortization. I don't think it's worth showing equity minus goodwill on the balance sheet. It clutters up the balance sheet, but the analysts can do it if they want to anyway. I think I would stick with the quantitative impairment test because we know how to do it now. And if impairments are anyway too late, removing this would make it worse. I agree that it might be useful to change the technical calculation of discounted cash flow. I agree that it's worth trying to identify all the other intangibles to make goodwill as small as possible. Now I wonder whether it's worth asking the question again, what should the IASB do, to see whether any of you have changed your minds after we've looked at the academic evidence. So maybe you'd like to vote again on what should the IASB do, and then we'll take any other questions and introduce Mr. Rodrigues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now I will call Jomar Rodrigues. Please get into the room because I think you have some comments on Professor Nobes' speech. Please, Jomar, join our room.
Sérgio, first of all, I want to thank Professor Nobes for the excellent presentation. I'm an honor to participate in this debate. I've been using your article, Professor Nobes, in my research and your books too. Again, thanks. The terminology of goodwill influences the recognition measurement process in accounting. It's important to note that the terminology is different between countries, as demonstrated in your presentation. It was even defined as depreciation, although the IASB has a comprehensive concept. It must be kept in mind that amortization is linked to the asset's used life. Determining asset's life is a challenge. Some countries take 5, 10, and even 40 years to recognize in this result. So, Professor Nobes, the goodwill that adds value to the business has defined or indefinite use of life.
So it probably does. But we start with the problem that we don't know what the goodwill is, of course, with any precision. So if we don't know what the asset is, and indeed I rather doubt whether it's an asset at all, despite IFRS 3 saying it is, if we don't know what it is, it's therefore impossible to estimate its useful life. And therefore the standard setters have come up with all these different numbers by guesswork, really. So I think that's the difficulty, that unless you know what it is, how would you know how long it lasts? So I'll stop there.
Okay, Jomar.
When you use the impairment approach, it can be understood that goodwill has an indefinite useful life. The IASB discussion issued in March of this year has focused on the topic. Some committee members have been concerned about the usefulness of this information. The following argument can be added to this, the amount of goodwill have increased around the world. What is your view on this movement? Should we only continue with this impairment approach, or we should go back to amortization approach or mixed approach? Professor Nobes, what's your view on this?
Okay, well, that takes us back to these points, of course. So I say here that I agree with the IESB, that's the third bullet point on this slide, that there should be no amortization of goodwill. And the reason is that, as discussed here, that since we don't know what it is and since we don't know how long it lasts, any attempt to amortize it over an invented period does not provide useful information. And the proof is that when we did have amortization, the analysts took the number out of the earnings calculation, suggesting that the people who use accounting information did not find it a useful number. And so therefore, despite the problems with impairment, at least it gives a piece of information which is potentially interesting, because it tells the investors, oh dear, there's a nasty surprise this year. Now, how big it is subjective. It may come sometimes too late, but at least it's a piece of information which is probably better than an amortization expense. Okay.
Professor Nobes, just to mention to you, we are with a little delay from your speech. That's why you are waiting a little from us.
In the Brazilian case, Goodwill has two components, like your presentation when you mentioned FASB-ASB approach. First, excess of fair value over book value of net excess, called goodwill. And second, pay too much. We use only one word in Portuguese, both cases, called ágil. A big problem I see in this case, how long should we keep goodwill in assets? Let's take an example of the acquisition of Palestra by Santander Bank. Santander Bank paid 7 billion to Banespa, and the market value was 2 billion according to the second bidding, and the book value was 1.8 billion. So we have two components of goodwill, one 200 million, and other with 5 billion. Following the ISB, it would be necessary to test the impairment of these assets. Goodwill cannot be reversed. So once that's come from earnings expectation, paying too much. And goodwill, it means in Portuguese ágil, like I told you, over the book value is reversible. It can be seen with this that a small difference in time knowledge already influences recognition and measurement. In your view, how long would these assets take to the result? Would it have a defined useful life or not?
Yes, this reversal of impairments is a very interesting issue. So you might know that in US GAAP, you're not allowed to reverse any impairments, whereas in IFRS, you must reverse impairments except for goodwill. So the logic is that since impairments rest upon your predictions of the future, you sometimes get these predictions wrong. And therefore, whenever you make an impairment, you should later keep asking, did we get that right? And if you decide you were too pessimistic, then you must correct your mistake. So why not for goodwill? And why not at all in the United States? And I think the answer is that the standard setters are very worried about reversals of impairment. They think that companies might make impairments in good years so that they can reverse the impairments in bad years, and that would enable them to make good years look a little bit worse, and then later bad years look a little better, so the income is smoothed. And so there is an argument here that if you think management will probably cheat in these areas of estimation, then reversals of goodwill are too dangerous. And so the ISB disagrees with that and says, well, the correct answer is if you make a mistake, you should correct it. But they agree that in the area of goodwill, there is so much guesswork that it is too dangerous to allow people to reverse their impairments of goodwill. And so I agree that assuming that nothing seems to be going wrong with your subsidiary, you could end up having the goodwill in your balance sheet forever. Although forever is a very long time, of course, and most companies do not last forever. But I agree that, but then the question is, if you don't want to leave the goodwill there forever, you would have to amortize it. And then we get back into a circle. So what period should you amortize it over? And then the debits become meaningless because it's an invented period. So I think it's probably better just to leave the goodwill there until there are nasty surprises, than writing it off in effect a random length of time. But I agree there's a problem. It depends on which problem you want, really.
Thanks, Professor Nobes. Sérgio, thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Jomar, for your debate here in our event. Mr. Nobes, do you want to go to the questions? I have several here. What do you suggest now?
Well, it's over to you, Sérgio. You ask as many questions as you like and stop whenever you feel you or the audience is tired.
I think we have an extra 15 minutes to finish our awesome evening.
Fine.
I will say a question again from, no, let me take a question from audience. I have from Q&A, one question from Camila Araújo Machado. In discussion paper from IASB, there is a question about maintaining separate disclosure of intangible assets and goodwill. Consider the intangible assets continue to be disclosed separately from goodwill and that intangibles are also amortized. What is the professor's opinion regarding maintaining the value of brands disclosed separately from goodwill, even if brands could have an indefinite useful life?
Okay, yes, good question. It's sort of in here. So this is indeed one of the questions. So the ISB has decided well, it's going to ask us the question, but it thinks that it is useful to continue to separate all intangibles. And my answer to that was there at the bottom, yes. So let's check why. So if you know that one of the things you have purchased when you purchase a new subsidiary is some brand names, and you would know that, of course, because there they are. You've got a legal document which gives you the right to brand names. Then it is probably useful to show that separately in your balance sheet. Now, it is true that it's a bit of a guess what its value is, but the number's going to be in the balance sheet anyway. It's either going to be in as goodwill including brands, or it's going to be in as goodwill one number, brands another number. I think it's probably more useful to have the two numbers, even though the brand name is a bit of a guess. Since the total is going to be the same either way, I think it's more useful to know the two parts, since one part is, as it were, real, the brand name, for which you have a legal document, and the other part is just the rest, whatever it is, goodwill. And it's true that many brand names have indefinite lives. So like goodwill, they would just sit in the balance sheet until they're impaired. But of course, you would know whether your particular brand name has been damaged. Brands lose value, other people copy them or whatever. So I think there's much greater chance that you will be able to do an impairment of a brand properly than if you just had everything together in one item on the balance sheet, a much bigger item. So on the whole, I think it is useful to separate the intangibles, even if some of them have indefinite useful lives.
Okay. We have a question from another colleague of us who I had the honor to study with him. I was a student from Paulo Lustosa, one professor of our accounting division. Mr. Paulo Lustosa asks, assuming all acquirees' recognizable assets are fair value revaluated to 100, and the acquirer pays for it 120 in cash, in your opinion, what the excess of 20 is paying for?
Well, in our discussion of what the IASB thinks goodwill is, and assuming that, so it's cash that's been paid, therefore we've got that measure right. And assuming that the assets in the subsidiary are easy to see, so we know how to measure those properly, then the extra 20, which we have deliberately decided to pay as the acquirer, we must be deliberately buying something. So presumably we've done our calculations and we think there's two ways of looking at this. We are either buying future profits, or you could try to express that in terms of particular types of assets. So maybe you're buying customers. Maybe you're buying skilled staff. Maybe you're buying very clever management. So that's one way of looking at it. These are sort of assets. The other way of looking at it is what you're really buying is future profits. That's how the economists would look at it. But I mean, both can be true at the same time, of course. But the point is, if you are the acquirer and you're paying cash, presumably you must have done some calculations of why you are paying that, and you must think it's worthwhile. And the fact is you have paid it. So we accountants can do the double entry for the extra 20. And that's how it gets onto our consolidated balance sheet. But as I say, there's two ways of looking at this. Either you can try to call it certain types of quasi-assets, or you can just say it's future excess profits.
Thanks. Another question from Mr. Paulo Lustosa is, impairment refers to the cost of the acquired goodwill or to the ability of generating future cash flows?
Well, we've discussed impairment, of course, and impairment is damage to things. So when we do an impairment test for goodwill, we test whether whatever the goodwill is has been damaged. Now, most obviously, if you buy a subsidiary and something terrible happens to it 1 year later, so it turns out that there were horrible lawsuits against your subsidiary. So it's a cigarette manufacturing subsidiary, and lots of people are suing it because their relatives died or something. Or you buy an oil company and then it messes up the Caribbean like BP did a few years ago. So you bought a subsidiary, you either discover that it has a disaster, or it had a disaster after you buy it, and then you say, oh dear, we paid too much money, it turns out. So our subsidiary is damaged. So the first thing we do is to knock the goodwill down and say that the goodwill is damaged, i.e. impaired. So that's the normal meaning of impairment in accounting. We take account of the fact that the asset is worth less than we are recording it at in our balance sheet.
Thanks. Now, Professor Nobes, I have one question. I know that this question is not straight related to the deep concepts that you show to us, but it's related to my field of research. And the Brazilian financial system went through the 2007 and 2008 crisis almost well. However, some companies that held positions in foreign exchange derivatives suffer from the quick devaluation of the national currency. In less than 3 months, it falls more than 30%, so quick. In a specific case, where the mechanism of the operation was so sophisticated that the technicians involved could not measure the size of the losses. In your slide 27, you show that language and impairment had a distinct issue, like actual fall in value and adjusting the asset in case of fall. That's the case. So what are the contributions of the debate of losses arising from derivatives financial instruments that run so fast related to the impairment, its measurements and the recognition procedures?
Okay, thanks, Sérgio. So you began correctly by saying that there is a sense in which this is not related to impairment because derivatives under financial reporting standards are just measured at fair value, and the gains and losses go into the profit or loss. So they're not subject to impairment, they're subject to something much simpler. They're just recorded at fair value. But so we don't need to apply impairment to derivatives. Nevertheless, your question still runs, of course, because it then becomes a question of, if we are trying to measure the derivatives at fair value, what do we do when the market goes down 30% or when the market breaks and we cannot measure it properly. And from a financial reporting point of view, we do have an answer to this. And the answer is found in IFRS 13, which is the accounting standard about the meaning of the term fair value. And it says that if anyone wants to look it up later, they can look up paragraphs B, 38, 39, 43, 44. It tells us that if there's a sort of crisis in the markets, what to do. This is called a disorderly market. And it says, try to adjust in various ways, but I won't give you the details, you can look them up. But I think in this particular case, the point is this. We don't do financial reporting every day. We only do financial reporting maybe once a year, or in some stock markets up to 4 times a year. So it does not matter whether a market collapses by 30% on November the 25th, or whether we cannot even measure the market because it's closed for a crisis on November the 25th. As long as the market is open on December the 31st, and it would be unlucky if the market for derivatives was closed on December the 31st, all we have to do is measure the fair value at the date of the balance sheet. We don't have to measure it on the unlucky day that the market went very strange. So from a financial reporting point of view, we'd be very unlucky if for something like forward dollar contracts or other derivatives, we had no market measure at the date of the balance sheet. So I'm sort of answering in a selfish way. From my financial reporting accountant's point of view, this might not really be a problem. But if it is, then we do have some paragraphs in IFRS 13 telling us what to do.
Thanks, Professor. We are almost finishing our section, but I think I may do the last question from Mr. Rodrigo Gonçalves, another professor of our accounting division. He says that, obviously, he, through the chat, said that he wants to congratulate you for the excellent exhibition. It is an honor for us of University of Brasilia to have you at our Congress. Rodrigo, I will say this in a few minutes. In Brazil, a subject that is much debated in the legal and accounting area is how to estimate the value of the company, especially goodwill. In a situation of judicial litigation between the partners, this is because there is an understanding that even in the case of a company in a going concern situation, the partner who withdraws from the company should not have a portion of goodwill because, 1, he is not taking the same risks the remaining part, and 2, it is a forced transaction under judice. What is your understanding of the goodwill to be determined in a situation of judicial litigation, referring to law?
This is a very good question because it takes us back to the origins of goodwill. So we first get a discussion of goodwill in England in the 19th century. I mean, a very long time ago, at least 150 years ago. And the context of the original discussion of goodwill was exactly this. That is, if you have a partnership and one partner leaves, how do you calculate, should you give that partner some of the benefit for the fact that the partnership has done well during the time of that partner? Also, of course, in the old days, if you joined Price Waterhouse as a partner, you had to pay something to become a partner because you were buying into a successful business. and in effect you were buying some of the goodwill, and what you paid would be given to a partner who was retiring, who would help to build up the goodwill. So it is very much the origin of the word goodwill. But I think this is not really a financial reporting question, because what we're really talking about here is internally generated goodwill, in effect. So this is not goodwill that's been purchased by the partnership. It's goodwill that has been created by the partnership. And therefore, it's not a financial reporting question. We're not allowed to put that sort of goodwill in the balance sheet. It's what IAS 38 calls internally generated goodwill. So it really is an economics and law question, as opposed to an accounting question. And of course, if the company we were talking about was a listed company, it would be easy, because you look at the share price, and when the shareholders sell, they get the market price, which includes the internally generated goodwill. And the new shareholders doing the buying have to pay a higher share price because the company's doing well. So the problem arises then when the company is not listed, or where it's not even a company, and where there are just partners who've built up the business. So as I say, this is not a financial reporting issue, so my views are not important. But what I would nevertheless think that if you've had 3 people running a business starting 20 years ago, and the business is now very successful because all 3 have worked well together, that when one of them retires, that one person should be paid some of the goodwill. This would automatically be the case if they were 3 shareholders in a listed company. So I would make it the case if they're 3 owners of an unlisted entity. But that's just my opinion. The law would perhaps disagree, depending on which country we're in.
Thanks, Professor Nobes. I think we are some minutes over the time, but I want to first thank the contributions of Mr. Katsumi, Cesar, Rodrigo, Jomar, Lustosa, from the audience, Camila. And I want to apologize to all of them, and also to Ludmila, Carla, and the audience, because we have several questions here, and we don't have enough time to still discussing with Professor Nobes. Professor Nobes, on behalf of Universidade de Brasília, and especially our accounting division, I have to say very, very thanks to you for an awesome presentation in our opening session of our 60th Congress. Please, when you come to Brasília, phone us, inform us. We will get you inside the UnB to show you our colleagues that are here discussing with you. Thanks a lot. If you want to say a few words on the ending of our meeting, please feel free.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I did come to Sao Paulo and Rio when we had a board meeting of the IASC during the 1990s. So when we are all allowed to fly around the world again, maybe Brasilia would be next. Anyway, thank you very much for your running the thing and the polling, and good questions, and for inviting me in the first place. I will say good afternoon to you, and I hope the rest of the conference goes very well.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, the audience. Thanks for all. We are very pleased with these opening sections. Our next sections will be the workshops. Please stay together because we have 2 more workshops today. Thanks, Professor. Thanks for all. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Quem tem uma empresa já ouviu muito sobre o novo normal. Mas já imaginou como pode ser o novo fenomenal? E o novo extraordinário? As novas possibilidades. O novo maravilhoso. Para levar o seu negócio mais longe, o primeiro passo é visualizar. E você tem o Banco do Brasil inteiro para te ajudar a chegar lá. Já imaginou? Banco do Brasil. Vem ser cliente.
Tchau.